Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as the Office for Inclusion and Diversity presents Unfinished Conversations on Race. I'm Tim Sands, President of Virginia Tech, and I'm especially glad that you're here with us today. While we have to remain physically distant, it's good that we can still come together through these means and listen to each other. Between the deep-seated injustices laid bare by the pandemic and the recent murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, our communities have been through hell, and especially so for Black Americans. And while I'm proud of our accomplishments over the last several years through Inclusive VT, this is a time to listen to you. What can we do to accelerate a sustainable transformation? Beyond words, programs, and resources, what structural changes are needed? What actions can we take that go beyond our current imagined ceiling for the pace of change? I'd like to introduce the leaders of today's discussion. First, Dr. Menah Pratt-Clarke is the Vice President for Strategic Affairs and Diversity at Virginia Tech. She's also a professor of education in the School of Education in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. She's been with us at Virginia Tech for 4 years now. In addition to 2 master's degrees, she has a PhD and a JD from Vanderbilt University. Menah is leading our Inclusive VT commitment and the university's strategic planning process. Menah and I recently spoke about race and diversity on our Making the Chair Fit conversation series. If you're interested in watching that, the program was recorded and is available on the Inclusive VT YouTube channel. Michele Deramo is an assistant provost for diversity education and has been with the university for 25 years. She is responsible for education and training initiatives that advance our diversity strategic goals. She has a bachelor's and 2 master's degrees in religious education and social change and a PhD in social and cultural theory from Virginia Tech. Please welcome Menah Pratt-Clarke and Michele Deramo.
Thank you. Thank you, President Sands, for your support and commitment and advocacy. I'm going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, sharing my thoughts and reflections to open our conversation. Michele will speak about the importance and value of educating ourselves and others about these normally hushed issues and how we can connect, build community through conversation. And then I will share concrete and specific opportunities for transformational leadership at Virginia Tech for my campus colleagues. These suggestions may be relevant for others as well. We'll then have about 20 or 30 minutes to reflect on questions. So please use the Qualtrics to share questions you may have. And you can use the hashtag VTUnfinished to begin a conversation on social media. Today, on behalf of Virginia Tech, I want to start by thanking my colleagues. I am extremely fortunate to be part of an amazingly diverse team in the Office for Inclusion and Diversity. But I'm also part of incredible colleagues, many white, at Virginia Tech, who are committed to this work. Many departments and units and colleges have made statements about the current reality of race and racism. We have been aggregating those statements and they're on our Inclusive VT page. We encourage you to read them. These statements are an important first step. And we must and can do more, and that is today's conversation. I see this as a moment for all of us to think out loud about how to move forward. But we can't move forward unless we look back collectively to our history. We are calling this an unfinished conversation as part of an initial program on our campus that began in 2018. And though this is called an unfinished conversation, my son said to me yesterday that the conversation he thinks never even started. His art behind me are part of a new social justice series he started last night. The 2 paintings are called Tired. As Bahamians would say, the people they them tired. And the quote from Fannie Lou Hamer that says, sick of tired of being sick and tired. Tired. Many African Americans are tired. Tired of asking politely and begging and pleading civilly for their humanity and respect. It is as if we have been at the mercy of white boots on our knees and necks and backs for 400 years. The reservoir is depleted. There's nothing left but anger, pain, a deep sadness, and a profound hurt. As Lorraine Hansberry once said, it isn't as if we got up today and said, you know, what can we do to irritate America? It's because since 1619, Negroes, as we were called at the time, have tried every method of communication, of transformation of their situation, from petition to vote, everything. We tried it all. There isn't anything that hasn't been exhausted. And now the charge of impatience is simply unbearable. This was written in 1968. Our team at Virginia Tech has 30 members in inclusion and diversity. 2/3 are African American. But there are also members from the Latinx community, the LGBTQ community, the white community, and the Asian communities. We had a conversation today, and our agenda was just sharing how are we feeling. It was one of the most impactful conversations about what it means to be Black in America today, and the impact not only on our souls as African Americans, but also on the souls of our entire team. It's a suffocation that's happening, an inhalation without an exhalation. The team shared about rethinking what t-shirt they wear when they walk outside. So in honoring that reality, I'm wearing a shirt from my mother, from the National Council of Negro Women, Inc., founded in 1935. Many of us no longer have words. And when our words come out, they are like knives, sharp, piercing, short, and abrupt. Many people of color, Black people, do not want to have conversations. They don't want to talk about it. And because we are not monolithic, some don't want to be checked on, some do. Some will bite your head off for checking on them the wrong way, and some will embrace you. And today, there's very little grace right now. It is as if many feel that America has had 400 years to care, to get it right, to see the humanity of African Americans, to see our value, to affirm our contributions, and it hasn't happened yet. And now you want to try? And so many are saying, no, not with me. Go talk amongst yourselves, go figure it out, and then show me with your actions. We don't want words, statements, empty platitudes, expressions of guilt and sadness. We want transformational change. And yet, I know, as many of us do know, that we must struggle together to get there. And this conversation today is about how we might get there together. In the spirit of Girl Trek, a new movement to support the wellness of Black women, I want to introduce myself. They have encouraged Black women to introduce themselves with the phrase, I am the daughter of. So I am the daughter of Mildred Pratt, a Black woman who became a full professor in 1979, when Black women were less than 1% of full professors. I am the granddaughter of Eula Searles, my mother's mother, whose mother was Rosa Hubbard, a slave born in 1863 in Landersville, Alabama. I am also the granddaughter of Elizabeth Horton, Lizzie, my father's mother, a Creole from Sierra Leone, West Africa, a country from which slaves were shipped from Bunce Island. And so as an African-American woman, I share my thoughts today. I've had to work hard to find words for this conversation. I've spent the past 2 years writing essays on my website about what it means to be a Black woman, a mother of 2 children, a boy and a girl, a wife, a friend, an administrator at Virginia Tech. And I'm currently writing a book called From Black Girlhood to Black Womanhood. And so I'm constantly in reflection about issues of identity in America. My last essay this week was called Dear America, and it was a history lesson about race. It's about embarrassment, shame, and the dissonance and silence that have become tools to avoid the reality of American history. It's easy to think that this conversation started recently with a few deaths of Black people. I want to suggest that this conversation began almost 400 years ago, when Africans were brought to America as slaves, with nooses and chains on our necks. We don't want to go back to the start, but that is the start, 1619. And then 150 years later, there was this revolution, the Revolutionary War, 1776 from Britain. But in the midst of a revolution that was about freedom and the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, the country was immersed in an economy that was about the denial of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to 4 million people based solely on their skin color and the necessity of their labor to create wealth and an economic engine for white plantation owners. The enslaved had no rights. They could be beaten and killed at will with no recourse. Women could be raped. There was no right to marry. Marriage was irrelevant. Husbands and wives could be separated. There was no autonomy over your children. They could be sold and separated and killed. They were treated and branded and marked as cattle, like chattel. White boots on black necks. When you listen to former enslaved people talk about slavery, and they're out there on YouTube, you realize the gravity of the inhumanity. The Federal Writers Project of 1938 captured the actual narratives of former slaves. So slavery was about inhumanity and the inhumane treatment of Black people. But it's the same issue we're talking about today, our humanity. Almost 100 years later, there was a civil war. It was a battle involving money and economics, civil rights, and justice. And though the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed the slaves, the war ended, the newly freed had nothing. Many African Americans remained almost as slaves, working the land in essentially an enslaved capacity. But we had hope because the radical Reconstruction came along and there was this promise of 40 acres and a mule. And that hope that we hoped so hard for was killed in 1876, when federal military protection was withdrawn and the Freedmen's Bureau was rendered ineffective. And at that point, African Americans witnessed the rise of white supremacy and a legalized manifestation of white hate. The local government's authority became almost untouchable, and the police, in a variety of guises, were able to exercise extraordinary control and power. Through the Jim Crow era of segregation, through written and unwritten laws of conduct, lynchings, and beatings, white boots were always on black necks. Then 1945 came and World War II ended. The GI Bill was supposed to help veterans. It ushered into law sweeping benefits for veterans, including college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance. Now, while the bill didn't specifically exclude African Americans, the racism embedded in its implementation ultimately resulted in white boots on black necks of 1.2 million Black veterans who had bravely served their country during the war, but didn't get the benefit of the GI Bill. Just as one small example, in 1947, only 2 out of more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to Black borrowers, only 2. And so this GI Bill, which was supposed to create a little bit more equity, especially for veterans, for African Americans, that included $8 million of education and training, $33 billion of home loans, never went to most of the Black veterans. And so this effort, this issue of injustice, didn't only affect veterans, but it also impacted non-veterans. And then the civil rights movement came along in the 1960s. There was a little bit of progress with voting, educational opportunities, but then redlining happened and redistricting, busing, highways that divided communities. And so here we are, 50 years later, and we're at this place of dissonance. It's the land of the free, the home of the brave. But in the midst of police violence, civilian violence, racism, educational inequality, policing in schools, disproportionate incarceration, healthcare inequality, disproportionate impact of a pandemic, we are seeing the legacy of issues of race in America. Rooted in race, maintained by racism, furthered by ignorance, and accelerated by systems and structures, consciously and unconsciously operating to maintain the supremacy and status quo, has resulted in white boots on black necks. America is an unfinished conversation about race. It's an unfinished conversation about Native Americans and their removal to reservations, the decimation of their culture, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans. They've all had their experience that their hyphenated identity reveals in America, a home of immigrants, a land founded upon immigration and migration and the importation of others from elsewhere. So where we are now, many of us African Americans do not have hope. Why should we? There have been protests before. Names of Black men and women murdered by whites have been recited as a painful libation to lives snatched ruthlessly and brutally. Their names on signs, marches held, protests on campus, demands made, but no systemic change. But because the work of dismantling America's apartheid requires a restructuring and a reorganization of institutions, systems, structures, political system, voting, education system, religious systems, the justice systems. It requires a systemic revision of policies, practices, politics, procedures, and philosophy, a reallocation of resources. And so we must ask ourselves, is this level of reimagining America possible? Many say no. And so many people feel this helplessness and this hopelessness. I, however, have hope. I have hope for America and for its ability to honor and fulfill the promise of itself as a nation. And my hope is rooted in two interrelated elements. The first is the power of education as a necessary vehicle for transformation. Education, formal and informal, enables us to learn and unlearn ways of being that have been destructive to land and life. The second element is educators, those formally trained and those trained by life. My friends and colleagues like Michele, who are willing to show up for conversations, but more importantly, are willing to do the work of transformation. And so I'm going to ask Michele to share her thoughts on what it means to think about this work from her lens as a scholar, as a practitioner, as an advocate, as an ally, as an activist. Michele has been an amazing colleague for me for these past few years, but also for Virginia Tech for 25 years. She's been a tremendous and brilliant practitioner, and I have learned much from her patience, her steadfast and unwavering work, her willingness to advance the faculty women of color in the Academy Conference that supports over 400 women every year, her ability to design education and inclusive pedagogy programs to change how classes are actually taught. And I have seen her quietly yet powerfully do transformational work at Virginia Tech for 25 years. So Michele, I'm honored to share this conversation with you and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Menah, for that lovely and generous introduction. I appreciate it. And I want to follow your lead in my introduction. I am the daughter of Jacqueline, known to lots of people as Jackie, who is a second generation Italian American from Pittsburgh, and the youngest daughter of Mary, Demi, who immigrated from Calabria at the age of 5. I am also the granddaughter of Rose Pagella, my father's mother, who was born in an Italian enclave of Pittsburgh. Both nanas had only elementary school education and were still girls when they married, one by choice, one by arrangement. All of these women, Mary, Rose, and my mother, were homemakers, caretakers, and mothers who lost sons through war and through illness. So my family, the Deramos, Ferreros, Demis, Pagellas, they're part of a larger Italian diaspora that left after Italian unification. They left because as Southerners, people of the Mezzogiorno, they were marginalized. They left to escape poverty, natural disasters, government corruption, and the Camorra. When the first waves of men came, they had no intention of staying. but at least half did stay, and they sent for wives and families and established little Italies all around the country. So these are not the Italians of Dante, Garibaldi, or the Genoese explorer, Christopher Columbus, for that matter, whose voyage was funded by the Spanish Empire and not by Padrone. Pseudoscience branded Southern Italians as inferior, a degenerate race characterized by disease, illiteracy, criminal proclivities. Criticism of Italians became integral to the successful legislative drives to enact the nativist literacy test in 1917 and the National Origins Act in 1921 and 1924. Discrimination and suspicion of Italians was compounded by the fact that most of us were Italian or were overwhelmingly Catholic, because some had anarchist, socialist, or left radical sympathies, and because when they came, these first waves of men came, they were innocent of the existing racial hierarchy in the United States and were willing to conduct business with Blacks. So why am I tracing this history? Because it sets the foundation for discussing whiteness. So whiteness is not merely an issue of skin color or ethnicity. Whiteness is about structures in society that advantage some groups and disadvantage others. So here's a story from the Italian diaspora or Italian history to further illustrate my point. So one of the most tragic incidents of anti-Italianism was the 1890 lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans. A police chief, David Hennessy, was shot in his way home from work. And as he lay dying, someone asked who shot him, and he replied, "The Dagos did it." So 19 men were corralled and held without bail for their alleged participation. They were acquitted, but a mob stormed the jail, some escaped, and 11 were murdered. This is not an unfamiliar story, certainly to my African-American colleagues, but here's a different part. In 1892, the federal government paid reparations to the families of the men who were killed. And last year, on April 12th, I watched in astonishment as the mayor of New Orleans, an African-American woman, issued an apology on behalf of the city to the Italian-American community. So consider these acts in light of the fact that in the history of lynching in this country, 72% were African-American. And to this day, no descendants of an African-American who was lynched has ever received reparations. So as an Italian-American, I have a conflicted relationship with whiteness. The Italians who first came to this country, whose labor was exploited and whose personhood was derided, in the next generation became Italian Americans who entered the mainstream of society. And that ability to successfully enter into that mainstream was facilitated much by the mythologizing of Christopher Columbus. That's a cultural theory. Who then became, these Italian Americans then became white. And they produced a person like Frank Rizzo, the Spacco il Capo, break their head police commissioner and eventual mayor of Philadelphia, who authorized police brutality in Black neighborhoods. I am part of a small group of Italian-American scholars who are interrogating the particularities of whiteness in relation to our own cultural and ethnic history. And this week, the long reviled monument to Frank Rizzo finally came down. We need to know history. We need to begin with our own history, where we come from, who our families are, the communities we live in, and not just the cultural, racial community, but also the religious communities that we're a part of. Our affiliations, our civic affiliations. Last year, the Office for Inclusion and Diversity supported a book circle we distributed over 300 copies of the book, The Little Book of Racial Healing. And at the heart of this book is the act of sharing family stories, specifically around the question, if my family was in North America during the time of enslavement, how does it feel to be associated with the oppressors? Or how does it feel to be associated with the oppressed? If my family was not here, how does it feel to be associated with people who were oppressed? Or likewise, how does it feel to be associated with people who were the oppressors? I should note that the authors of the book are a young Jamaican woman and an older white man who discovered that his ancestry includes that of slaveholders. So this process of truth telling is at the foundation of his work, of his partnership with communities. We had planned to bring these authors to campus for multiple conversations with our senior leadership, students, faculty, our council on Virginia Tech history, because our campus does have historical ties to slavery. But before their visit, COVID-19 shut the campus. And so we are working to bring them back to campus, at least virtually, hopefully in the fall. So we are a university community. And so what we do best is education. We educate ourselves. That's part of our job, is to always keep on top of our game, to always be reading and learning, also educating others, educating students, educating the public, contributing to the knowledge industry. So it makes sense then that we respond at this historical moment as educators. One thing our team is doing is we're reading together How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And our leadership team of the Division of Student Affairs will likewise be reading it. And there are a number of units around campus led by diversity directors and inclusive VT representatives who want to read that book. If they can get it, it is currently sold out of stock on Amazon. And I think that tells us around the nation, consumers are saying, we need to step our game, we need to learn more. And these books and this one being a very important one, speaking to the current moment, people are seeking it out. People are sharing book lists, articles, films, podcasts. The leadership team of the Leadership and Social Change Residential College has compiled a collection of anti-racism resources that include syllabi and teaching aids. It is on our website, our Inclusive ET Unfinished Conversation website. Colleges have two Virginia Tech students, Brianna Wallace and Autumn Gupta, with the VT Gray program, curated a resource called Justice in June to provide a starting place for anyone trying to become a better ally. People are coming forward, they're looking within their own disciplines. How can we learn more? How can we educate ourselves? How can we educate others? I want to make an important observation about this content that people are seeking out. It's emerging from the third wave of Black liberation that is catalyzed by the movement of Black Lives Matter. At the center of this is a reorientation of our language around race talk. It's a reorientation that shifts us from conversation on and reconciliation, because it's comfortable to go to reconcile, and it shifts us toward truth telling and action. So if you say you are not racist, then demonstrate how are you anti-racist? How do you advance policies and ideas that create equity? How will you address historical harms enacted by your family, your community, your profession? How will you address historical harms maintained by the whiteness you inhabit? And I think this question also, anti-racist question of how will you address historical harms? How will you advance anti-racist policy as opposed to racist policy is not just one that is being asked by people who are white or people of color who are not Black. I think that this is also a question being asked within the Black community as well. How do we address historical harms in a way that creates equity through policy and ideas? We cannot move forward with policies. We cannot move forward with new ideas as long as Frank Rizzo continues to stand in the plaza in Philadelphia, as long as Robert E. Lee continues to preside over Monument Avenue in Richmond, and likewise all throughout the country where there are monuments enshrining people whose values represented racist policies and racist ideas. Those need to come down, otherwise we're not going to be able to move forward. So we must confront the question both individually and institutionally, and as a university community, how do we enact anti-racist policies and ideas in order to redirect the legacy of inequity and exclusion that has even defined our own institution? What do we do to recognize that not everyone was always included, not everyone was always welcomed at Virginia Tech, and specifically the one group that was most obviously, that was most deliberately denied access were Blacks and African Americans. So over the past week, we have seen entities, certainly across campus, but actually across the nation, but I'm just going to talk about the ones here on campus, issue statements in an effort to speak out against this institutional violence and in support of Black colleagues and Black students. And I want to say that these statements, there are action plans. Sometimes we think, okay, the statements, it's a ritual. It's something that we need to do so that we look like that we care, that we're paying attention, that sometimes they're mistrusted as being symbolic. I want to urge all of us to read those statements, to challenge those statements, to move those statements forward. Look for the statements for your department, for your organization, for your caucus, and there's your place to act. I want to make a few highlights. Lee Lehrman, Dean of the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine, his statement acknowledged the racial inequities and health disparities in our health system that is now so obvious during this pandemic, where we see greater rates of illness and death from COVID-19 among Blacks and African Americans. This is an important observation. This is an observation that medical professors, that medical students can and should act upon. Dr. Laura Belmonte, College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, a fellow Italian American, also a historian, pointed to the racist double standard at the heart of the American contract. The American contract, the way we see humanity, the way we govern ourselves, the way we set up our society, these are all the kinds of things that my colleagues in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, that's their work. This double standard is something that they can address, some action that they can take, that they need to move forward as they educate their students to go out into the world and work in those systems that historically have perpetuated this racist double standard. We also see some, the LGBT caucus and the Women's Center. Their statements did something different from many of the others. They included a fourth name, that of Tony McDade, a Black trans man who was also killed by police these past weeks. Their statements remind us that anti-racist work is intersectional. Provost Cyril Clarke, who was raised under apartheid in South Africa, and Richard Blythe, Dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Studies from Australia, they both reflect on their privileges as men coming from places that grappled with their own racial divisions, and now coming into this country and seeing the tensions of race and the divisions of race from a different lens, from a different historical legacy. Our faculty senate recognized that the Black and brown members of our community continue to be the ones who bear the pain and weight of systemic racism in all forms. And yet, those same people are the ones who have disproportionately borne the burden of carrying forward our principles of community and our core values of inclusion and equity. And we've even had some student organizations step up and make statements, even though they have been far from campus for several months. Our Jewish and Asian American students each made statements pledging to collaborate with Black student organizations. And in fact, I know already that those students have done work together. And so there's so much more. Let's ensure that these statements are more than symbolic. Read these statements, challenge these statements, convene and scheme using these statements as a starting point for anti-racist action. What does this mean for the actual work we do, for the people we are preparing, for the resource we produce? What's it mean for that? That's where we begin. And let's speak about one other reality that usually remains unstated. And I say this because I've done lots of diversity training with predominantly white people, not 100%, but predominantly white people. And even people who are diversity stakeholders get tired of talking about race or want to talk about all the races when we talk about racism. And I want to say that when we talk about racism in the United States, even when we're talking about all the races, we're talking about anti-Blackness. I want to quote here from an opinion piece that appeared in the New York Times yesterday by Dr. Kihana Mariah Ross, who is a professor of African American Studies. And Dr. Ross writes, anti-Blackness is one way some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defangs it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity. And I think Menah certainly gave very personal, very historically anchored examples of how there is that inability to recognize the humanity of Black folks, the disdain, the disregard, and disgust for our existence. Blackness is inextricably tied to slaveness, so that in the minds of many, the relationship between humanity and Blackness, even 400 years gone, is irreconcilable. And any group entering American society enters into that Black-white binary, that whiteness, anti-Blackness framework. And any group entering American society must negotiate where they fit within that binary. I've explored how it's happened with my family, with the diaspora of which I am a part. I see where the struggles were. I see where history's been forgotten. I see the people who have risen up and made great contributions, like Anthony Fauci, who has we've heard so much from recently. But then I also see where terrible things happen in neighborhoods like Bensonhurst. And it matters. I feel it. I feel the shame of that association. And I feel the call to work. Now, where do I work? I work here in the seat of the Confederacy, interestingly. And my role is to answer the question so many of you have of what next? What do we do? How do we have these conversations? What do I say to my family? What do I say to someone who refuses to change? There's diversity training addresses a lot of those questions, and we may get to them more in our discussion. But for now, I want to say a couple things that is moving forward with diversity education that hopefully will help us to really have a better appreciation, and with that appreciation and insight and understanding, better capacity to act and respond to anti-Blackness in a world of whiteness. One thing is a course that I developed for inclusive pedagogy. And inclusive pedagogy, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that language, it's a way, it's teaching in a way so that all students learn and all students feel welcome. So when I do inclusive pedagogy workshops, it's primarily professors who are in classrooms or who are in co-curricular instructional environments. And I realized that from my own experience of being in the classroom, that there truly is an unfinished conversation around how individual Black students experience being in our classrooms, if it's maybe because they are the only ones, or because there are topics that impact them differently than other students, about the continual stretch that they need to make every day as they go into those dialogues, knowing that their voices may be in the minority. And so one of the things I did was create a course entitled Courage to Teach, Race in the Classroom. And the intention is really to speak to white faculty, and specifically white faculty for whom this matters. Now, my personal feeling is diversity training does not work for people who are not invested in diversity and inclusion. Diversity training is for people who are invested and need to build their capacity, who need to know how to act so that they can then influence their environments. Courage to Teach was inspired by two experiences that I had. One was with a student I taught probably 15, possibly even 20 years ago, who, without my realizing it, without my paying attention, I was what I call in the workshop, privileging whiteness in how I was grading. Now, what do I mean? So we have a student who is one of a minority of African Americans in a class of students who are from a higher wealth area of Virginia. So these are students who are from very privileged backgrounds. And these students had a particular, they had a particular personality, they had a lot of enthusiasm. And I was judging students not on their criteria or the quality of the work, but I was, in my implicit bias, judging students based on this threshold of enthusiasm that was normalized by the behavior of a particular majority students. That student called me out. I am happy to say that I am still in contact with that student, who is now a successful professional, but she taught me by calling me out that I was not paying attention and that I was privileging whiteness in how I taught. Of course, we go more in depth in the workshop. The other experience was one, and this was many years past. I am doing a much better job of paying attention. I use rubrics. I just have much more, when I teach a course, I think about why we're doing things, how we're gonna, what we're gonna grade students on, and so forth. So I'm a much better instructor at this point. But we're doing a class where we talk about how Christianity in the United States helped to justify slavery. And it was a fascinating conversation. A lot of students coming from very religious backgrounds were thinking about material in a completely new way. But this was not a comfortable conversation for that student. And I didn't know that until I received her reflection paper, in which she said, I'm not going to talk about slavery when I'm the only Black person in the class. I think this is an unfinished conversation. I haven't yet figured out how do we handle that? I don't know. But I know it requires me to pay more attention. It requires me to better understand, to take the initiative to better understand who my students are, how they may be experiencing a class, and that they're experiencing these subject matter differently. And so Courage to Teach, and actually all of the inclusive pedagogy courses, are efforts for us to not simply go into the teaching learning environment with this idea that everyone's the same, or that there is one way to look at the material and either make it or break it. Something else that is coming forward in our diversity education is that our new module that is required for all incoming students, called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, it has a component on anti-Blackness. So though this is a module that just, it does a wonderful job of looking at diversity among people in a very rich way. And yet I was so pleased when I saw that even as it took this very even-handed approach to looking so broadly at diversity, it still recognized the importance. We need to talk about anti-Blackness if we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity. So my comments then, I wanted to focus on these 3 points of whiteness, anti-racism, and anti-Blackness. As a diversity educator, as I move forward, creating diversity education that responds and gives people behaviors, skills, and language to meet the goals of the diversity strategic plan, I also want to create education that is responsive to the historical moment. We're going to talk more at discussion, but I'm going to step back now and turn it back over to Menah.
Wow, Michelle, that was great. It's really wonderful and just inspiring in terms of the passion that you have and your commitment to not only educating and interrogating your own experience, but then authentically sharing that with others to help shift and change our reality. So I'm going to spend a few minutes is really talking to my wonderful colleagues at Virginia Tech about what specific actions we can engage in here to work towards sustainable transformation. They may help those of you at other institutions, other places of employment. They're not unique to Virginia Tech, but my commitment is to Virginia Tech. And so I'm sharing these in the hope that as Hokies, we can aggressively move forward to make the world a better place. Virginia Tech has made tremendous progress, but we have a long way to go. On the website that Michelle referenced, Inclusive VT, Unfinished Conversation page, we've created some resources. And I've shared a few PowerPoints about the history of diversity from presentations I've done here. And I encourage all of you to look at them so we can appreciate the progress that has been made over decades. From being founded as an all-white male institution to where we are today. But I want to specifically focus on what's happened in the last 4 years and the power of leadership and alignment. I think it's often easy in these moments of pain and frustration and crisis to not want or feel comfortable acknowledging progress. But I want to acknowledge our progress and say, yes, we have made tremendous progress, and yet still we have more to do. So for the past 4 years, we have been building an infrastructure for this work at Virginia Tech. We have been laying a foundation painstakingly, brick by brick, program by program, person by person. We have dug a deep foundation that we are building upon. The foundation started with the board and President Sands, a commitment to inclusive VT as the institutional and individual commitment to UPROSUM, our motto here, that means that I may serve, a commitment to that motto, that I may serve, in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence. From that definition of inclusive VT, we identified 4 goals, with the first core foundational goal being sustainable institutional transformation. And that transformation would have to include representational diversity, an inclusive, welcoming, affirming, and safe campus climate, and a commitment to the integration of diversity and inclusion into curricular and co-curricular programming. So having defined inclusive VT, having identified 4 goals, we then set about to create an infrastructure to advance these goals. The infrastructure has included the Inclusive VT Executive Council led by the President and Provost, a faculty diversity committee of 24 professors at Virginia Tech, diversity strategic plans at the college level and most departments, diversity committees at the college level and unit level, diversity directors, and senior, what we call inclusive VT representatives. This structure serves as the vehicle and the method by which sustainable institutional transformation can be accomplished. In addition to the structure, we integrated diversity into the strategic plan as an actual specific strategic priority, the UPROSM difference, with goals, metrics, and milestones, fairly aggressive metrics and milestones. And it's not just the UPROSM difference strategic priority, but there's a strategic priority about talent and being a destination for talent. And we recognize in that priority as well the importance of diversity. And so we began to identify 4 years ago opportunities to inject and integrate diversity into our standard processes, policies, and procedures. As part of the Pathways, which is our general education curriculum, as part of that curricular revision, the campus approved a specific change to require every student at Virginia Tech to take a course that addresses the critical analysis of identity and equity in the United States, recognizing that there's a particular history here that as an educational institution, we have a responsibility to make sure that when our students leave, that they have a base of knowledge about the experience, especially in Virginia, in the seat of the Confederacy, what our history has been. We also adopted in 2016 a pre-enrollment requirement that every student, undergraduate, graduate, transfer student at Virginia Tech has to take a Diversity 101 online basic diversity and inclusion online course, in addition to the already existing pre-enrollment courses on sexual harassment prevention and alcohol education. So these courses, the requirement means if students do not fulfill it, they're not able to register for classes. And so there is a consequence and a demonstration of the level of commitment to ensuring a basic level of understanding about what our commitment to diversity here is at Virginia Tech. And the goal is that the online course is just the start of a conversation, of a personal opportunity to educate yourself. But then as part of your experience at Virginia Tech in first year classes in the housing and residence life community, that you will begin to have conversations about what it means to be part of a diverse community, what it means to practice inclusion, what it means to learn about people who are very different than you. And so we developed education programs and strategies to address and mitigate bias in the search process by requiring diversity advocates and encouraging the use of diversity statements in every search. We provided a partnership structure for colleges to participate in programs to help diversify the faculty, including the Future Faculty Diversity Program, that even in the midst of our current hiring challenges, we're looking at continuing because we always need to continue to identify talent. In collaboration with admissions and enrollment management, their team in the admission enrollment management office wanted to identify and eliminate any barrier that could impact students of color, first generation, low income students from applying to Virginia Tech. I just think that's a really important strategy for how you make change, sustainable institutional transfer. You actually look at every single point, every single dot. What happens when you get the application? What happens when you apply? What happens along this trajectory of a process that could be an impediment? And how do you eliminate it? And so their director specifically talked about how they look to eliminate any barrier that could impact minority students, students who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, from feeling that they could even apply to Virginia Tech. And so in addition to that effort, we started the Black College Institute. It's a summer program that supports students who are interested in the African American experience. It's not limited to Black students. The students who apply are primarily African American students, but there have been students from other identities and backgrounds who have benefited from understanding what it means to be part of the African American experience. And as part of the Black College Institute, we have worked to demonstrate to parents and families that Virginia Tech is a viable and important and a good option as part of our land grant commitment to their families for the education of their children. This year, we had almost 800 applications. And so the program has grown from this really barely existing program 3 years ago with almost maybe 100 applications to this very real, strong, important source for defining who we are at Virginia Tech to African American community. It's a competitive program. It's been in person, a 3-week program for rising juniors and seniors. And this year, with an amazing team, we just had our check-in call today. It's a team of 20 individuals who've been just working behind the scenes to create an online version for this program. It's modeled and inspired by the Hispanic College Institute that we've hosted here at Virginia Tech for several years of our commitment to outreach and recruitment of underrepresented minorities. Both of these programs work in partnership with the College Access Collaborative that works with high schools and middle schools across the state of Virginia in rural and urban areas to identify talent and to work towards recruiting them to Virginia Tech. These efforts have had really good outcomes. And so in addition to President Sands coming and setting, I think what many felt was a very ambitious and perhaps not realistic goal of having 25% of the incoming class of Virginia Tech students be underrepresented racial minorities, 40% of them being underserved, first generation, low income, those aggressive goals were set. And so as a campus, we needed to work towards meeting those goals. And so this year, we're anticipating an enrollment of Black students at Virginia Tech of 8%. And when I came here in 2016, the enrollment was 3.8%. And so that outcome, which we often ignore when we're thinking about things are not changing, that's a real shift. The Latinx enrollment has gone from 7% to hopefully 10% this coming fall. We're very close to this goal of 40% URM, underrepresented students, USS representation. And so we've not only focused on recruiting, because it's not just about bringing difference to campus, but how do we sustain and support their success? And so last 2 years, we created a program called SOAR, Student Opportunity and Achievement Resources, not limited to students of color, but working towards supporting them, recognizing that for a variety of reasons, there's a disproportionate retention and graduation rate, often due to financial challenges. And we need to find ways to start having those conversations. And so when the current pandemic hit, the SOAR team reached out to almost 3,500 students of color, largely first generation, some of them low income, and started hearing about the challenges that they're experiencing financially just to support college, even before the pandemic. Working 2-3 jobs, supporting family members. I mean, the magnitude of the burden that they were carrying, not only for themselves, but their family members, has been extraordinary to hear. So because we care about the success of students, not only coming to Virginia Tech, but their experience here, we created community and cultural centers with directors. So the Black Cultural Center, El Centro for the Latinx community, the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, the Native American and Indigenous Community Center, the LGBTQ+ Resource Center, and the Intercultural Engagement Center. Each of these centers has a director that's engaged in programming and community building, not just for the groups that most closely identify with the center, but programming for the entire campus community. So when people say, how can I get involved? They're offering programs for you to get involved. So next week, the Making the Chair Fit series, you can join us at 5:30 on Friday to learn more about the women, some of the women who are leading these centers. So my hope is that we can celebrate the progress that we're making. The progress that includes being part of a leadership team that has 3 African American senior leaders, that has 3 women deans who are leading the College of Engineering, the College of Science, the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, an institution that is demonstrating its commitment in very tangible ways. So I'm saying progress has been made, but I'm also acknowledging that there's more to do. And I want to shift to talking about what can we do. So I took a little bit of time to set that context to share that at Virginia Tech, there's a structure. I'm encouraging each of you to learn about it, to engage with it, and to hold it accountable. Review the diversity implementation plan. Ask yourself, as Michele suggested, does it address race? Does it address issues of anti-racism? Does it address issues of anti-Blackness? Does it mention Black? Does it mention white? Does it mention race? Does it mention LGBTQ issues? Does it mention disability? Does it mention gender? Or does it just broadly say diversity? If it doesn't address specific issues, you can change it. You can start a conversation to change the plan. Because we create stuff and we can recreate things. Because it's your document. It's your units, your college, your department's document. Look at your diversity committee. Does it meet regularly? Does it feel empowered? Is it planning programs? Is it advancing a welcoming climate? Do people even know if it exists? Is it designing programs for Inclusive VT Week? Is it designing programs to support Principles of Community Week, which are foundational for us at Virginia Tech, principles of community that came out of the struggle of African Americans in 2003 on our campus? So if the committee is not, if you don't know what the committee is doing, it's an opportunity to ask. Are there book circles that, Michele said 300 books were ordered. Did you read one? Did you have a conversation with anyone about it? Do you know who your diversity director is, who's been behind the scenes, trying to get out in front of the scenes? One of the things that really I appreciated is that many of the college statements were also from their diversity directors. It's from the dean of the college in partnership with the diversity director, because the work cannot be done alone. So I think the opportunity is to look at your structure. I often remind colleagues who are doing this work of diversity and inclusion, and many of these offices are staffed by people of color, that it's not our offices that are responsible for diversity and inclusion. We can coordinate and support, but everyone is responsible. Our offices do not enroll students. We don't admit students. We don't admit graduate students. We don't hire faculty. And so the units and the programs that oversee those responsibilities need to be held accountable. And the accountability doesn't have to only come from a dean or department head. It can come from concerned faculty and staff and students who can say, you know, what are you doing? I would encourage departments to be more courageous, to limit the power of those in your units who you know are sexist and racist, who make statements that are offensive, that are homophobic, and don't address the reality and the humanity of every person. We all know who those individuals are in our departments. And I encourage you to address that. If bylaws need to be revised to address the issue of who can vote in a department, who can serve on committees, who makes hiring decisions, then now's the time to review the bylaws. And if only a majority is required and you don't have to be unanimous, how do women and people of color who might be in the minority, how are their voices heard? We have a future faculty diversity program to help support the identification and recruitment of diverse faculty. Departments should participate and begin to develop ongoing talent identification strategies to diversify their department. So what does this mean? They should actually review every job description for its content. Do you require a diversity statement? Do you know how to evaluate and review those statements? Are you willing to not move forward on a search if the pool is not diverse with women and people of color? White men who want to be allies have to be willing to cede power and authority and voice to women and people of color in meetings and conversations and decision-making. In an essay I wrote, I called it, excuse me, I have something to say. I was reflecting about how difficult it is to find space for our voices as women and women of color. There are white men at Virginia Tech and other men who participated in a program called White Men as Full Diversity Partners. And now is an opportunity to start having those conversations with other white men and women to think about strategies for transformation. We have to value the voices of our students. We have to allow students of color in particular to not have to engage in activism when other students are not. They're just coming and having a great college experience, and then our brown and black and students of color are spending their time protesting, writing concerns. Their grades suffer. They have an experience of empowerment, but it's unfair. And so my hope is that even though we want to hear and value their voices, we don't place upon them this burden of solving the institutional racism. I've had a wonderful conversation with Frank Shushak, the Vice President for Student Affairs, and he and I have spoken about creating an inclusive VT Student Advisory Board of diverse students across the campus and colleges to just advise us, to hear their voices of what students want and how we can partner together to create the Virginia Tech that is a transformational place and an example for others. So I'm saying to my colleagues at Virginia Tech, to department heads, deans, and vice presidents, thank you. Thank you for your leadership and commitment. Please take time to engage and think about your diversity structure, how to review it, support it, revise it, enhance it, resource it. Specifically address race in your plan, and if it doesn't, make sure it does in response to all identity groups. Review your policies and bylaws in your unit, those that are written, some are unwritten. Commit to requiring diversity statements in every search and supporting diversity advocates. Speak and call out those in your unit that have been known to perpetuate sexism and racism and be unsupportive of the LGBTQ community, those with disabilities. Encourage faculty, staff, and students to share their experiences with you without fear of retaliation. And to faculty and staff, ask your departments and units to share their plans with you and ask them how you can engage in the work. And assume a leadership role and be engaged and begin to educate yourself so you can educate others. Be part of conversations. Students, I ask you to be as curious and as open as you can to learn about others. It's okay to find safe spaces, but places of transformation are often stretch spaces where you are out of your comfort zone, meeting new and different people. Take time to say hello, even through Zoom, to the one student in your class that you know is different than you, who may speak different, who may look differently. Go to them first when you need to create a group. Reach out to them to join your organization. Say hello, smile at them. Alums, I want to say thank you for caring so much about Virginia Tech. I'm always so delighted everywhere I go when I see a Hokie plate and someone's like, are you a Hokie? I'm like, yeah, I'm a Hokie. So the Hokie brand and reputation is strong. I was in Delaware and someone was like, what are you doing here? I'm like, what are your Hokies together? So there's a commitment and a culture to Ut Prosim and service that's powerful. And so I would just encourage each of you in your families and places of work to have these conversations and have them in your communities. To join organizations like the Dialogue on Race that's here in Blacksburg, the NAACP, the National Council of Negro Women, and be part of the solution. To contribute funds, your time, your resources to advancing diversity. Finally, we are asking each unit on our campus to host a conversation on Juneteenth. So June 19th is a holiday. It's associated with the day that African Americans in Texas found out about the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years later in 1865. And so we're encouraging, we had a conversation with our diversity directors and senior inclusive VT representatives for each department, unit, college to just host a conversation on that day, maybe using your diversity, your statement in this moment as a starting point, as Michele mentioned. She's going to be creating a facilitation guide for the conversation, but we want, it has to start with conversations. And so I'm just thankful for this moment for Michele and I and President Sands to share our thinking on this. I've been amazed at the questions that are coming in. I think we've had over 300 questions, and our team behind the scenes has aggregated some of the questions. So let me just briefly share what some of the themes are for the questions. And I think we're going to have to figure out an appropriate format for really thinking about what all these questions mean. And Michele and I and President Sands are not experts on any of this. I think one of the most profound things that Michele shared was like, I don't know. There's a lot of things none of us know, but we can all begin to educate ourselves and become a little bit more adept at navigating this particular reality that we're in. So these are the themes of the questions. One is support for students of color. Another is a question about programs, initiatives, and policies. What are those that are currently in place for students? Policies, initiatives for faculty and staff. How do you engage and initiate difficult conversations and have open dialogue? And how do you become an ally? And so those are sort of the buckets that questions have fallen in. And I thought I could just pull out a few and ask Michele to just kind of reflect on those. One of the questions that resonated with me is a question that asks, it says, often there is an unspoken rule that being professional means avoiding discussions related to the emotions of racism. And you and I were in our staff meeting this morning where there was just a whole lot of emotion. Yeah. And so the question asks, what can we do to normalize the emotion tied to systemic racism and ensure that leaders are modeling and open to engaging in these discussions? What are your thoughts about that?
Wow. So I think that in higher education, emotion is something that is generally not, is expected to be something that you put aside because it interferes. It interferes with your ability to think clearly. It interferes with, what's regarded as professional and so forth. And yet there is a growing body of scholarship that is in fact looking at the content of emotion. I do think that it will help people, that there are some things, some language prompts, some ways of how do you have difficult conversations, that while it does not dismiss emotions, it helps people to use the emotions, harness the emotions to have the discussion productively. So we have, we're really have an awesome colleague, Reese Ramos, who is our university ombuds. And Reese has created for us an inclusive ET insight on having difficult conversations, where he provides really a plan of thought for entering in a discussion that will be emotionally charged or has the potential to be emotionally charged. And of course, Reese is also someone, if you want to, if you are needing that to really unpack that or to really work with those emotions, I think Reese is someone who is an expert, who is able to be a listener and to be a sounding board, to give feedback. But you can't have a conversation, or I mean, you can have an academic conversation about race, but even academic conversations about race are full of emotional content. If the emotional content wasn't there, then there would be then it wouldn't be something that needed to be discussed. And we know that it is. I think that, okay, so that said, something that I've learned over time, and that is maybe how to engage the emotions of someone else. So I think the person who asked the question, we're really thinking about their emotions and how to, where that fits and how to manage that. But I know as a listener, or when I hear something emotionally charged, oftentimes our response is to defend ourselves or to armor up against that emotion, or to, explain away that person's emotion, which is of course very condescending, but happens quite a lot. But I think sometimes the best to do is really to listen for the emotion. So an example, one of the questions, and this is an easy example, it's a softball example, but when we first started doing inclusive pedagogy with the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, one of the questions I asked was, what are some of the things you're hearing? Or where are some of the resistances? And the faculty who are participating raised a couple of questions that reflected those resistances. And then I asked, so when you hear that question or you hear that statement, well, this isn't rigorous, or aren't we babying them if we, treat them with care? What's the risk? What is at risk of loss? Because oftentimes when there is a negative emotion, there is a risk that something is going to be lost. And that's what we want to focus on. That's where we want to speak to that and find understanding there. Someone else on campus that I think would be going to be a good advisor on this is Henry Yampolsky, who's in the Office for Equity and Accessibility, who also did an insight for us on active listening. How do we literally prepare our bodies to be active listeners? So those are just a few thoughts.
So I think I appreciate that, Michelle. I think it does have to start with just the courage that no matter what the outcome is going to be, we have to be able to have these conversations. Yeah. I think it's helpful to set the stage to say it could be emotional, and that's fine. And sanction the presence of emotion, to give permission to it, and to have the leaders model the conversation. I know often in our team, it's like, okay, we're going to start first. So the leadership team will kind of assume that reign to be an example. I think you've done marvelous work with this Inclusive ET Insights. I'm not sure everybody really understands what that is. Can you just share a little bit about what they are and what that program is?
Well, Inclusive ET Insights are very short educational modules. They're like a 3 to 8 minute video. Usually they address one question like, how can I be an ally? Or how can I practice active listening? Or how do I have difficult conversations? Since those are 3 that are pertinent to this discussion. And we identify someone on campus who can be who has the expertise to speak to that. And that's what it is. And they're online. And so they're available to anyone, anywhere, anytime, which is important because historically, the in-person training really left out a lot of people who either had work schedules that prevented them from participating, people who were on one of the campuses beyond Blacksburg, people whose schedules were demanding. This was a way to make it accessible. Additionally, the Inclusive ET Insights are tools that units can use to foster their own conversations, because we provide discussion guidelines. So, and that's one of our goals, I think, is we want people to have that capacity to talk to each other. We don't have to always be brought in and, to make that happen. We need people to be talking to each other. And I think that the insights are a tool for that.
Right. So one of our, our core mission really is this capacity building on the campus. And so I often talk about, I feel in many ways, there are many people of goodwill. And goodwill is a necessary, element towards this work, but it's not sufficient. And so we have to be able to move from goodwill to actual skills and competency.
Yes. Yes.
The work. And the thing I like about the insights is it can be shown in a departmental meeting. A departmental meeting can be used to say, let's just show this insight and let's just have a conversation.
Right. Yeah, and in that case, it reaches people who really have no intention of ever looking at diversity content.
Right. I mean, we struggle with this dynamic of what we call the willing, the people say, the people who always show up are the same people. And I actually think that's not necessarily always the case. I think, in slow ways, expanding that network. But many times the people who show up continue to need to show up to build their
Yeah.
content. Can you just reflect a little bit on what does it take to expand the network of those who want to engage in this?
Well, I think that there's top-down and bottom-up approaches. So I think that you've done amazing work here, really bringing leadership on board. And this is where people talk about the slow movement of change. I've been here 25 years, so I can see this is a completely different institution, just even 5-6 than it was 5-6 years ago. So you do need to have leadership who is going to authorize that this is our core values, and this is, if you're going to have implicit bias training for everyone on a search committee, you need to have someone who is going to authorize that that is expected of everybody. Okay, set that climate, set that expectation. But I also think that people, no matter what their sphere, makes a difference, can make a difference in their environment, in the work that they do, in making the workplace more inclusive, in being mindful of who is a part of the team, to be mindful of accessibility in your environment, okay? And so on, there's many things. So I think that the people who do keep coming back, we need you to keep coming back, because as you keep coming back, you are building a culture. And that's what culture change is. More and more people continue to buy in, but we need some expectations that you're expected to buy in. I did have, once when we used to do the Diversity Development Institute, we had some participants whose supervisors instructed them that they should go, and they went reluctantly. And they ended up being really strongly bought in, that they just loved it. So I think that there's, if it's done well, if it's done so people feel like that they are affirmed, we don't no longer do in-your-face shaming approaches to diversity, the call out, we don't do that anymore, then people will find themselves. And sometimes it'll even touch places in people that they've not attended to. Like, for example, once I was doing something with some cooperative extension agents, and I knew that there was one older man in the back of the room who thought a lot of what I was saying was hogwash. But then at the end, we had this very short video, and the people presented in the video were people with different disabilities. And that touched him because he had a daughter who was disabled. And that made a difference. So I don't know if that fully answers how we expand, but those are some things I've seen.
Well, I think the opportunity, and I think it is a responsibility, so if we've gone to a diversity education program, it might have been personally fulfilling and inspiring to us. But I think the change happens, and I think that's one of on our website, we talk about connect. So the connect is that it impacted you, but now you're going to connect with someone else.
Yes.
So that you're sharing that. So they may not have been there, but you're furthering that knowledge, that information. And so that idea of connecting and communicating and creating community about what you've learned, those individuals who attend can be very powerful champions.
Absolutely, yes. And I've seen many of them. I just a couple names right off the top of my head, Megan Shepard, who is a professor in vet med, really always learning, and then bringing it back to vet med and bringing that to people, having reading groups, having small workshops with people there. And that's spreading. That's spreading the wealth, the information. I also think, Jill Seibel, who's working with all of these professors in STEM on inclusive excellence with our Howard Hughes Medical Institute grant. And she, yes, is the lead principal investigator on the grant, but I see her show up to things. So she is building her knowledge, building her capacity, making a commitment.
Great, thank you.
Put it on.
Absolutely. So I think we only have a few minutes left. President Sands, I want to just start by thanking you again for spending this time listening, and want to just give you the opportunity if you want to share a few final thoughts today.
Thank you for that opportunity. I've taken lots of notes. It's really helpful for me personally. I took away two or three nuggets from this conversation. And one was, I think, Michelle's statement about holding the authors of statements accountable, and not necessarily in a threatening sort of way, but being partners and collaborators and mentors, and pointing out where a statement, if it's not followed up on, isn't worth the words that you used. You really have to follow up, and we have to help each other be honest about that and do that work. The second point that I thought was really useful for me personally was the concept of anti-Blackness and the black-white binary, and that being inherent in our history. Of course, that seems obvious when you say it, but I think the reflection that I take away is, as we think about other identities and each individual for that matter, how do we fit within that black-white binary is a very American way of looking at this. And I think we all have to reflect on that and not assume that every identity is somehow to be treated the same. They're all important, but they all have to be studied and thought of in a structure that fits with our history. And the other thing that hit me, and I wasn't thinking about this until I reflected on Menah's really incredible history, 400-year history, which I think we all know parts of that or all of that, but to hear the way you framed it, Menah, was really special for me. It made me reflect on that historical foundation of the black-white binary. And I kind of took that personally while you were talking about it, because one of my one of my pandemic weaknesses has been binge watching. I normally don't binge watch, but I've done a little bit of that. And a couple of weeks ago, I was binge watching Jamestown, and I heard my name, which is a really weird feeling, I have to say. You're watching a portrayal of events 400 years ago, and you hear your name, not my first name, but my surname. I heard the name of Edwin Sands, who was Archbishop of York in the early 1600s. He was the treasurer of the Virginia Company. So he was the one who was responsible for its organization and foundation. I learned by poking into this that he was the architect of the General Assembly, Virginia's General Assembly. And he was the one who sent Scots-Irish to Jamestown as indentured servants. What the story left out was his role in bringing Africans as servants or enslaved people. I don't know what his role was. And so that's my personal unfinished exploration that you made me reflect on. And by the way, Edwin Sandys is 13 generations back for me. And I didn't even know there was any relation until that binge watching experience, which has really kind of changed my life in an interesting way. I'd like to thank Michele and Menah for their really patient and persistent leadership. It takes patience, it takes persistence, and that's not easy. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching for the questions you submitted. You know, the great thing about Zoom is the few of us can have a great conversation. We can bring things in from the outside, but it isn't the same thing as engaging in person. And we don't get to hear the inflections and the emotions associated with those questions. But we do pledge that we'll look at those questions and get back to everyone. Some of them fell into buckets, as the term we used earlier, and some of those buckets were addressed by Michele and Menah. But there are a few buckets we have left to go, and there are certainly some questions that spilled outside those buckets. So I'd like to thank you for everyone watching for your engagement, incredible engagement. I think we had 300 questions or thereabouts. And we'll continue this conversation, but more importantly, we'll turn it into action, and we'll raise the ceiling of what we thought we could do going forward. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a good evening, and I hope you're safe and well.
Thank you.
Bye.